Hello everybody and welcome to the channel. We are going to look into Victoria 3 Dev Diary number 1, all about Pops today, and see how it compares Victoria 2, what kind of updates we have, and what to expect, I guess. And so of course I did a quick run through before I did this video, but I wanted to jump in with you guys, just kind of explore what exactly is going on. And so of course there's this one line in the Dev Diary that kind of caught my attention. And so it says in Victoria 3, Pops are the country's engine. They work the industries, they pay the taxes, they operate the government institutions, and they fight the wars. They're born, they die, they change occupation, they migrate, and they organize, get angry, and start revolutions. And so that's actually a really good summary of what even Victoria 2 Pop system was kind of like. And so, of course, in Victoria 2, we had it where they were already working the industries, they pay the taxes. Of course, you didn't really get to see as in depth as I'm sure Victoria 3 is planning to go into. Like Victoria 2, you can look into the Pop screen, you can see exactly what their income is, what kind of savings they have. And Victoria 3, I imagine, is going to have something a little bit similar, except they've been talking about going way more in depth. Even see right here, you have a photo of the Pop instead of your little like static images. I assume this is going to be a little bit animated. Maybe. We'll see. But they're born and they die. And I think death in Victoria 2, as far as Pops go, wasn't as modeled. You would have death as far as like events that pop up. There's diseases that would go on that would cause you to lose population. It's also during war. If you're fighting a battle on top of a province, that province would start losing Pops. There's also your soldier Pops if they were in a battle, if they were in a war and they were losing a battle, or even fighting a battle for that matter, they would die as well, and you would lose soldier Pops. And so of course Pops did die, but in this case, it almost seems like they're generalizing it. You have Pops that are born and then they die. So maybe it's modeling their age. I don't know about that. That could be a little bit of a stretch. That could be interesting, but of course that might slow the game down if you're doing that much as far as calculations go. But maybe there's a model as far as a certain percentage of your Pop might eventually die of old age, type of thing. But here you have the first little picture they're showing here. French Catholic clergymen. You can kind of tell they look French. They have the little mustache. They're obviously right here. They look pretty Catholic. They have little Catholic cross going on here. And they're also a clergyman. Of course, they have the little suit here. But the big thing here that I'm looking at, of course, besides the whole religion thing on the top right corner, is that there's this secure thing. It didn't really go as in depth about that inside the Dev Diary, but you can assume that maybe it has something to do with stability, has something to do with how they feel about the government. If they're secure, then they're happy, right? They're not going to join a rebellion. They're not going to join a revolution. And so, of course, you have this Pop that, I mean, they're happy with the government, so they're going to stay happy with the government. They're going to keep it around. And so your goal here is probably to keep it as happy as possible. I also notice here down in the other picture that it says secure 22. And so you can also infer that maybe there's obviously a lot of different things you can do as far as the gameplay goes to impact how your populace feels about the government. And then there's also this other interesting section that they were talking about different professions that each Pop might have. And so you have some of the Pop's professions you will encounter in Victoria 3 are aristocrats, capitalists, bureaucrats, officers, shopkeepers, machinists, laborers, and peasants. And of course, you can invest in each of those different Pops to sort of build up your government or your country. Some of these we are seeing. Again, aristocrats, of course, is already in Victoria 2. Capitalists, bureaucrats, officers, laborers, for example, are all already in Victoria 2. Shopkeepers is a new one we're seeing. That wasn't in Victoria 2 before. And peasants wasn't either. Prior to that, we had, say, like farmers, for example. Laborers, we also had, but laborers and farmers were kind of synonymous. Laborers worked specifically on like mining goods, trade goods, and peasants or farmers would work on, of course, farming and vegetables, and those are sort of things in Victoria 2. Shopkeepers, I imagine, obviously are going to be maybe like artisans type of thing. They could be replacing that. Machinists could be, of course, more industrialized type of artisans. Or maybe they're more like craftsmen, of course. You have your craftsmen, you have your clerks, so maybe it's something to do with that. Maybe shopkeepers is a replacing of your clerks, and maybe machinists is a replacing of your craftsmen. Maybe something like there. Of course, they've also mentioned that it's not going too in depth. This dev diary, there's a lot more to share, but this is a very generalized sort of take on what is going on in Victoria 3. And it also says that every variation of profession, culture, religion, and workplace in the world gets its own unique pop. Exactly like Victoria 2. In Victoria 2, you would have hundreds of different segments of your pop. So you have like an Afro-American pop who was a Protestant, who was also a farmer. And they might also all be specifically a part of a sort of revolution. They had a social movement they were part of. And that would be basically synonymous with what that pop was. You might have another pop, exact same thing, except they might not be a social or part of a social movement. And you'd have another separate pop group for that. So maybe it's going to be the exact same thing as Victoria 2. And so, of course, what they say is that there's going to be tens of thousands of pops in the world working, migrating, procreating, and agitating. It sounds pretty much like a replica of what Victoria 2 is all about. And so it seems like they're going to sort of go into the same Victoria 2 pop system, just kind of beautify it a little bit maybe. But of course, this is only the first dev diary, so there's going to be a lot more information we're going to be seeing here. But you can see this little this photo right here. Let me move my camera just slightly and shrink that down so you guys can see. You have the state. Of course, Victoria 2 already had that culture. Same thing, Victoria 2, religion or Sunni or Sunni, same thing. Literacy rate also being represented here. Discrimination is a brand new thing though. And we didn't really get a whole lot of information in this dev diary exactly what discrimination's about. Possibly cultures that aren't your primary culture or your accepted culture, and they're going to be represented at least in a different way. They might not have as much political strength as it says over here, as much opportunities to make money, might not be able to be promoted as easily, and so there might be a little some connotations there. This is all sort of theoretical. I'm just kind of making assumptions here. Radicals and loyalists. So of course, it seems like you have another dynamic here. And so in Victoria 2, you had radicals, obviously, but loyalists, not so much. They weren't as represented in Victoria 2. So it looks like you might have die-hard loyalists for the government, and you might also have die-hard radicals that are opposing the government. And so that's an interesting take they're doing here for the pops. Interest groups seemed like probably like a social movement type of thing. Just rebranding it. Political strength is definitely a bit different. In Victoria 2, it was represented more like how much voting power they might have had, how much, because you would have at the beginning of the game, of course, your rich population would have higher voting percent, like they would just have a higher voting power. Because you had your reforms, of course, your voting reforms. You could go from, you have universal on the bottom end, where universal voting would basically kind of give your poorer groups higher voting weight in the elections. So whoever was part of those other pop groups would be able to have their voting strength matter more. And so I'm assuming political strength is probably similar, though there is K right here. I don't know if that's synonymous with how much money perhaps it has, because it is an aristocrat pop, so they might have a lot of money. And so maybe this particular group has 7.97K as far as the population, but yet they have 39.3K political strength. I'm not sure. We're probably going to go more in depth in that later. Net income, of course, they obviously, aristocrats invest. They're your upper class citizens of your country, and they probably, that's how much money they make. So of course, if you tax your aristocrats, your upper class more, their net income is going to drop. If it drops, of course, they might not be happy. They might feel less secure. You might have them becoming radicalized. And so that's something you might have as a repercussion. It did say that every single decision you make is going to have an impact on your society. on your pops. So basically, even though you don't have direct control over your population, you're going to have indirect control. So whatever you do with your government, whether it's taxation, whether it's tariffs, whether it's policies you're enacting, you're going to have some type of interaction with your pops. And of course, down here, looks like you have a generalized view of what exactly aristocrats are in the country setting. This is the country setting right here. This seems to be maybe the state setting here. Same thing with this, that, in fact, it says right here from subsistence farm, so maybe the aristocrats are over the peasants. They might be, for example, in the USA, you might have plantation owners. They would be aristocrats, and on their farms, they would have slaves. It didn't say anything about slave pops in the dev diary, so I'm a little bit curious about that. You have 6.22k dependents. And now it did talk a little bit about dependents down here in the dev diary. So yeah, dependents. So after by abolishing child labor, the amount of income dependents bring home will decrease, but will make it easier to educate your populace. So dependents are obviously what it looks like are children, perhaps. And so 6.222 thousand dependents. Okay, so it does split it up. Okay, so you have 7.97 thousand aristocrats in general. Then you have 1.74 thousand the workforce of the population. So it looks like you only have 1.74 thousand actually working aristocrats, and then their dependents are non-working aristocrats. So they're part of the aristocrat population, but they don't work. And so there's a little difference there. You can see down here that there's a lot of aristocrats in the Ottoman Empire, for example, and their total political strength is right here. There's probably a general view of how much political strength in total your populace has in your empire. You might be able to break it down a little bit more by just how much of a percentage that they have in your empire as far as their political strength goes. And you also have what they support. So this particular population group, looks like it actually is their entire social class, their entire profession. Supports local governors, supports the armed forces, supports, looks like, just some Sunni, I don't know what madrasas is, but something Sunni, obviously. And you have other interest groups. And so, of course, it looks like it's a little bit more flexible as how pops promote. In Victoria, too, there's a lot of sort of ambiguous promotion. So basically, if you had a higher literacy rate, you would have populations have an easier time promoting towards, for example, craftsmen. So it's probably a similar thing in Victoria 3, where your literacy rate might also affect promotion. Also says right here, to a lesser degree, literacy. So, of course, if their wealth increases, you might basically lower taxes for your poor income class, and they might be able to have a higher chance of promoting to a higher income group. Lower class, middle class, upper class, as represented in Victoria 2. I'm not sure how the taxation system's going to be in Victoria 3, but maybe it will be similar. So pops whose culture faces discrimination take a much longer time. And so, of course, what I kind of said or mentioned earlier is that discrimination is probably going to have an effect on how, I guess, involved a specific culture might be in your society. And so you might have a country like the Ottoman Empire, who has a lot of, like, in their central core areas, they have their Turkish culture, but then in their colonies, where they've expanded into, like, the Middle East, they might have a lot of other cultures which might be discriminated against, and so they might not be as productive for the empire. And so even if they have a lot of population in their empire, they might not be able to produce as much because there's so much discrimination going on. Whereas another empire might even be a little bit smaller than the Ottoman Empire, but it might be full of core or, like, primary culture groups, might have an easier time as far as being able to manage their empire. Whereas, of course, the Ottomans in this case are going to have a much harder time. Victoria II, of course, the Ottoman Empire had a lot of territory, but they weren't nearly as strong as a lot of these European countries, and it's usually really difficult in getting the Ottoman Empire to progress into even a secondary power, or maybe not a secondary power, but even a great power. They would start the game as a great power, but they would drop fairly quickly as the other empires took over. But it's because their literacy rate was so low, and they wouldn't be able to progress nearly as much. And so you have this, of course. And then pretty much in finality, there's, of course, it talks about a little bit about laws. At game start, you might not be accepting women to work. And so, of course, that goes back to the dependent thing. So, of course, you have 1.74 thousand aristocrats who are in the workforce. It's possible that this might only be representative of male aristocrats because females aren't actually working. And so, and then, of course, you have that broken down. It's broken down. So, actually, I'm kind of curious if this is similar to Victoria 2 in a way. So I'm going to grab my calculator really quick and do some math. But if you times 1.74 times 4 is 6.96. And so maybe that's not as representative as I thought it was. But in Victoria 2, for example, you'd have your population that you'd have in the top left corner of the screen. And then if you went or moused over it, it would show a number 4 times that amount, basically representing children in the workforce or even women in the workforce. And of course, looks like Victoria 3 is going to take it a step further and allow you to maybe make adjustments there. Dependents might be more of a flexible number instead of a static percentage of your total population. And so that's a little bit of an interesting thing that we're seeing here. Of course, you're going to buy abolishing child labor. This is a little bit of is interesting because it sort of infers that there's going to be a whole lot more laws in Victoria 3. Victoria 2, not so much. I think it was like 20 little social reforms, maybe like 4 or 5 different. I think it's 5 actually. You have your education, you have your healthcare, you have work laws, work hours laws, pensions, and unemployment benefits. I think those were the 5 in Victoria 2. And it looks like there might be a little bit more going on in Victoria 3 as far as what type of laws you might be able to enact. And of course, education would be a big thing as far as educating dependents, which is also interesting because dependents, like I said before, it was a static modifier. In Victoria 2, it wasn't represented at all besides being a number that's, 4 times the amount of your regular population. And you'd only ever be able to see your male working class citizens as far as your population goes. And so that's an interesting thing where we might actually be able to interact a little bit more with what were these more ambiguous numbers that we saw in Victoria 2. And so that's interesting. And so, of course, in finality, it looks like it says that, in short, nothing in your country runs without pops, and everything about your country affects those pops, who in turn provide new opportunities and challenges during your tumultuous journey through the Victorian era and beyond. And so it looks like obviously pops are everything about Victoria 2, or Victoria 3, which is exactly how Victoria 2 was. Much more than any other Paradox title. Hoi 4, Europe Universalis 4, CK3, Imperator Rome. Populations were represented, but not nearly as in depth as Victoria 2 ever went, and Victoria 3 looks like it's striving to do. And there's Stellaris there as well. In fact, Stellaris is probably a little bit more interactive with your pops than a lot of other Paradox games. And so it's going to be really interesting to see what happens. And of course, it looks like they're talking about capacities next time. Not entirely sure what that means, but we're going to find out, of course. But that's pretty much it as far as my analysis of the Dev Diary. I don't know what this is in the top right corner of this portrait, so I'm not really going to be able to touch on that. But of course, it's important to keep in mind that a lot of this is an early footage. It's under development still. We're going to be seeing a lot of changes in the future, and it's not exactly productive even for me to go ahead and start bashing on what they're developing. I am pretty excited. I'm still probably on the honeymoon phase, if you want to make that reference, of Victoria 3 being announced and me going crazy like, oh my gosh, Victoria 3 is being announced. It's actually being made. And the fact that I am giving a lot of Victoria, the developers obviously, and Martin, a lot of leeway as far as what they're going to do. And so I'm super excited. Hope you guys are excited. Leave a like down below if you enjoyed Dev Diaries, if you want to see me do more. Hopefully we can do something a little bit more in depth as things go on. So anyways, I'll see you guys next time. Bye. As always, please leave a like down below and consider subscribing if you would like to see more content just like this, more frequent uploads. If you have any suggestions, go ahead and leave a comment down below, and I'll see you guys next time.